Welcome to Cost Cafe. My name is Tim Root. I'm here with Maggie Friedemann.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Maggie, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, my name is Maggie Friedemann. I had 38 years with ExxonMobil. I retired about 3 years ago. I mostly in project management, mostly in cost and schedule. My last few years I was an advisor globally and traveled the world talking to people about their projects.
So which parts of cost and controls, because I know you spent a lot of your time in project controls, at least since I've known you.
Yes, I did both estimating and controls, and I did some scheduling for the upstream as well.
What parts of that intrigued you? Because not a lot of people, not a lot, that's not fair. There are a large number of people who come in and get good experience and then go off to be project managers, and part of that's by design.
Yes.
But there's fewer who come back.
Yeah, it's always a good idea to run people through cost and schedule as young people who want to go on to project management, because it gives them the basis.
Right.
To then have people who want to stay in it, I think it's people who really have a desire to help the project managers get their job done better. I think for me, the nice thing about ExxonMobil, hope it's okay to talk about ExxonMobil, was that we had estimates that were done in-house that had lots of years of experience to know where we were. So we had an advantage. You can go get an estimate and you don't know how good that estimate is. So how do you control against an estimate that is based on I don't know what?
Right.
So what I found that was great is we did the estimates and then we would go out and we would control against those estimates. And because we had years of experience on knowing how things cost, and we had a cost group that indexed things up, we felt like we had a pretty good tool about knowing what our budget was, and it was a pretty good, solid budget. So to control against that made life a little easier. Now, I did some work in the upstream, and there they didn't have those skills. They didn't have that years of experience. They were doing a lot of one-offs.
Right.
It's really hard to get a one-off to get any experience. So you do things a little bit differently, and
especially
therefore controls
in frontier environments where nobody's done any work.
Right. So it might be, here's $1 per ton of a structure. I mean, you have 6 items in your estimate.
Good luck.
What are you going to control against, right? So controls in upstream was very different than controls in downstream. I found that it was great to be able to have a yardstick to measure things by, because then I was able to say, oh, how are we doing against that? I found that the other thing I liked about controls is there was the 6-step process that we used to use and we used to teach, which was, what's the plan? What's the actuals? And almost everybody does a really good job of plan and actuals.
I find that's the easier part.
Accruals is a question mark for some people. That's a little hard for people to get a hold on. Where am I really?
Yeah.
But if you've got a good handle on plan and actual, that's pretty good. Then you get into the more interesting parts of the job, which is, what's the forecast? How am I going to figure out the forecast? If I know what my gate is coming through the door, and I got more people coming through the door than I have, and I did the math, and I have more people coming through the door than I thought I was going to, and they're not getting as much done, I'm pretty sure you're going to have an overrun.
Yeah.
So you can look at that, and a lot of people were amazed that with just basic common sense and math, we could come up with a forecast, and they were like, no, never going to happen, never going to happen. You're like, okay, let me just play it out, and we'll see.
I've seen that on the estimating side too, despite years and years of data.
Well, and wishing doesn't make it so.
Right.
So some people want it to be less than it's going to be.
Sure.
And you're like, well, my job is to tell you what I think it's going to be. So there was forecasting, but that's not where it stopped, because of course then you'd say, okay, well now let's talk to the project manager, and that's where it got interesting. I have to convince you of what I think is true, and I want you to do something about it.
Right.
So now I need to influence you to make a decision, and now I'm going to check to see if that decision actually improved things.
And you also have to have enough knowledge of project management to understand what a reasonable recommendation even is.
That's right. You can't just go in and say, I want you to, hire 16 cranes.
Right.
Well, it's going to take a while to bring them in and set them up,
have
and
room
then
for
when
them
they
anyway.
grab them. Yeah,
Right.
I can't close the main drag. Never going to happen.
Right.
Okay, so that's not a practical suggestion. So what are the things that are practical, and where are the places that they're spending money that they could save on to pay for these other things that they really need to be focused on? So that was the part that I liked about it, was not just the easy part that every contractor does, but I thought it was also applying the engineering knowledge that I had years of experience doing to say, what do I think is going to happen? And
Right.
human nature, and influencing people, and influencing without authority. That was the interesting thing about project management. Even the controls manager didn't really have a whole lot of authority. I didn't have a whole lot of people I could boss around.
Right.
Most of my job was as an advisor, where I was going in to advise people to do something that they typically didn't want to do.
Right.
So how do I get them to do what I want them to do without, I had no stick.
Right.
So I had to learn how to influence without any authority. So
Yeah.
all of those good soft skills came in handy in the job as well.
I've found it interesting that a number of conversations that I've had in a variety of contexts ends up coming back to the communication and
the soft skills are really important. In a lot of ways, it didn't always do a good job to go talk to the cost people and say, here's all the things you have to be doing. When their project manager would come in the next day, I don't want you working on that, I want you to work on this.
Right.
So how do you get the boss on board with it as well? One job I had, I really feel like my job could have been titled marriage counselor. So I had a project controls manager and a project manager who could not have been more different. He was very introverted, she was very extroverted. She had her finger on the pulse, but she was very flamboyant. If he came in and said, I need something, she'd go, wah! And so their styles of working were very poor together. He would get upset, he would walk off, he never got what he wanted, she never understood why she couldn't communicate with him, and I spent 9 months with that team every month.
Oh my goodness.
Going up there, working to get them to talk better to each other. Because the truth was, she knew what was going on.
Right.
But she couldn't adequately explain it in a way that he believed it,
Right.
and he didn't want to believe that the project was off track, so he was fighting her every step of the way, and so the project team was not functioning well together.
Yeah.
So I called that one of my jobs, was marriage counseling.
Yeah.
But it did end up working, and they actually still are pleasant to each other today.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing. Not everybody gets to work on a good team. I thought a lot about leadership, and having had bosses who I thought were excellent leaders, and how they formed team dynamics and how their people would work for them and just give 110%. And I had bosses that weren't so good. And so when I got into leadership positions without a lot of authority, my job, I felt like, was to try and build those team dynamics. How do I get the most out of the people I have? I can remember going into one gal and saying, I thought she was doing a whole lot more accounting type things than she should have, because the accountant wasn't really doing their job. So she was going through every invoice, and it was taking, these stack of invoices, this thing.
Which is necessary, but it's time consuming and less value add than a forecast for sure.
Right, and that was the job of the accountant, was supposed to be doing that. She was supposed to be attesting to services, not doing all the math.
Right.
To say that the math was done right. That was his job. So trying to get her to understand, and sitting down with him and saying, look, this position is really your job. Because she was like, I'm working 60 hours. You can't do what you want me to do. All right, well, let's talk about what you're doing. How much time are you spending on various different things? And it turned out that was an area she was spending 20 hours a week on. And it's like, well, it didn't leave time for her to do her job.
Right.
And so we tried to find ways, because she looked at me and she's like, yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. You're going to leave here and I'm not going to do any of that. I'm like, okay. So how can I help you fit in the things that I think are the most important for you to do your job and to learn for your future? Right. And not, make you work 80 hours a week. Right. Because I frankly didn't believe that was a particularly helpful thing. That was one of the funny things about cost engineering. They teach you, you look at the math, you look at the curve for turnarounds, and 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and how much, it's like, why? Yeah. You're not gaining anything. Right. But you couldn't
very quickly start to lose, actually.
Yeah, and you couldn't tell a project manager of a turnaround that you were stupid to work 70 hours a week. But the truth was, you weren't getting any more than you would if you were working 40. Yeah. Nobody would ever believe it. You couldn't imagine them going to their refinery manager and saying, hey, we're going to work 40s on this $1 billion.
Right. 3-week major event, right?
Right. So you have to understand there's some things you'll never be able to get them to
Sure.
fly, even though the math seems to suggest it. But
Yeah.
is this kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah. Yeah, and even if you don't have that much influence, and even if you're not really necessarily trying to get them to change their mind dramatically, if you can't stand behind your numbers,
Yeah.
part of it is confidence, but even part of it is, here's the soft spots that I recognize I have. We can talk about those. These are the ones I feel really strongly about. Unless you have information that I don't know, I'm gonna debate you on it.
Yeah, and I believe that the debate should take place. The project
Absolutely.
manager should buy into the forecast every month.
The best team that I worked on, we would have meetings every week, and we didn't debate every week, but there were plenty of times where it was, hey Tim, I was in this meeting and I heard this. Oh, okay, thank you. That changes that will change my forecast.
Yeah, absolutely. I also used to think about my job as an investigative reporter, and really looking at intel. Right, so also being kind of a spy. I mean, the value of the forecast was going out and talking to people and saying, well, where are we on that? And you
Right.
look out, and you walk around, you think productivity is bad, you go out for a walk and you see people standing around. Why are they standing around?
Yeah.
Oh, you go up and you talk to them and it's like, well, I don't have any materials. Okay, well, why don't you have materials? Well, we sent a guy to the tool shop to get tools. Well, why didn't you have the tool shop ready at 8 a.m.?
Right.
So there's some things that obviously say things aren't going well. Now, can you fix them? It's really hard to do that. It's
Sure.
hard to turn around productivity on a project, especially when people are getting paid to be there, and
Yeah.
if I'm getting 50 hours a week, and I'm slow, I can get more weeks on the job. So human nature is a lot of it as well. So
Yeah.
trying to figure out, but gathering all that intelligence together, the investigative reporter stuff, and trying to say, okay, what do I actually think is going on? I always felt, and this is where I differ a lot with my upstream friends, is that I think you have to have boots on the ground. I think you have to go to the field. I think you have to be in the engineering office. I think you have to see that. Now, to be fair
I
to
think
that,
you can get an okay forecast, assuming that your project team is very good at communicating.
yes, if you are not boots on the ground, you have to have intel from the people who are that is
Agreed.
there. Now, that's where I felt like the upstream, because their projects are somewhat remote, it's a little harder.
Sure.
So, I'm not sure I would consider some of those projects doing true control. On the other hand, they didn't have a yardstick that was a good yardstick. So how do you do control on a project where you don't have that? We were fortunate that we had those kinds of things to start out with. And working with the groups that I worked with, my bosses quickly found I knew what I was talking about, and they trusted me, and they put me in front of management, refinery management, just because I knew what I was talking about, and some of it wasn't easy, some of it was challenging.
Sure.
But
it's hard to deliver bad news, even if you firmly understand and believe and can defend the bad news.
And of course, what happens is people don't want to hear bad news, and it can't be as bad as you've said, and why do you say that? And then they start attacking you. Same thing in the estimate. Well, it can't be that much. And I had a great boss who used to say, if you want to cut the cost, cut the scope. Tell me what you're going to cut out. I'll reduce the cost.
Right.
Not reducing the cost just because.
Right.
So that was a very helpful. Another great project management saying that I used to use a lot is people don't do what you expect, they do what you inspect. So one of the things you couldn't do was just rely on somebody's word. We had a project where the first piece of equipment, we had the crane up waiting, and we had phone cons with the airfin company that, oh yeah, we're going to be there, we're going to be there, we're going to be there. The day it was supposed to arrive, we'll be through. It's like, it's like, okay, now we're paying for a crane for 3 weeks before we actually get it.
Right.
And that's why I say boots on the ground. If it hadn't been just phone inspection, but somebody had gone to see it, they would have said, this isn't ready.
Right.
Could we have then at least prevented an expenditure on the crane, we wouldn't have put it up as soon.
Right.
So, lots of things we learned from mistakes that were made.
Sure.
That's a lot of what experience is.
Mm-hmm.
I used to go into projects and they would be like, I remember using 30-year-old, almost 35-year-old experience from my Wyoming days in a project in Norway. So the Norwegians hired an Italian company, and I said, okay, let's go look at your laydown yard, because if your laydown yard isn't marked properly, when the first snow hits,
Right.
you won't be able to find anything.
Right.
And that's what happened in Wyoming. They had they had low signage because they wanted to be able to forklift and drive over it, and snow came and couldn't find a thing. Right. Everything was beautifully pristine, covered in snow.
Yeah.
But 35 years later, I had that conversation with the project manager, Tor, and he was, he's like, at first a little skeptical. I'm like, okay, look, you don't have to take any of my advice, but let me tell you, here's what I've seen.
Yeah.
Just make sure you are thinking about this and have a way to identify where all the stuff is.
Right.
It's not a very difficult thing if you think about it in advance.
Right.
It's not easy to fix in Norway when it snows and stays on the ground for a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting the relatively minor interactions or experiences that you pick up early in your career that you end up coming back to as either examples or things that, oh yeah, this is really applicable. I really need to think about this.
And it's like weird stuff, like some things that you think, oh, surely that's never going to happen.
Yeah, especially when most of your work's on the Gulf Coast, right?
Right. But the thing is, we're in a global world, so there are things that we have to think about. Even small things like that project I had in Wyoming, we had all the pipe coming in, and there was a wreck and some of the pipe fell off. Well, we didn't have any extra. We only had what was on that thing, and when things fell off, that was it.
Yeah.
So people didn't think ahead to say, well, what could possibly happen? And this is what's interesting about project controls, is you're constantly trying to think about what is the, if I take this step in my cycle of, forecasting and trying to make corrective actions, what are the unintended consequences of that?
Right.
And for a lot of that, you might have to ask your project management people, because it's like, I haven't done this before, but if we do this, what happens? I've seen a lot of bonus penalty schemes that have gone really bad because of unintended consequences, because we didn't think through what might happen with that. If we do that, what could help it happen?
Well, and even if you have a really good idea, I've found that kind of tactic of asking the questions in that way. So what happens if this happens?
Right.
To kind of lead people in the direction, which sounds devious, but I don't mean it that way. To lead people the way you want them to go,
I
right?
think it's getting people's buy-in.
Exactly.
I need to show you that I have actually thought through all the what ifs. And while I don't have all the answers, I have a lot of questions that we should have a discussion about.
Yeah.
And I think that helps people quite a lot.
I think so too.
So communication is huge. Getting intelligence from the community, both from the contractor and the Exxon Mobil or the owner side. Right. Because let's be real, we didn't have people who were always very nice, and so sometimes they were heavy-handed and tried to rule with an iron fist, and yet that doesn't necessarily mean everything's going to be great. Right. So talking to the people who on both sides of the equation to say, well, okay, I know he wants that. What is really happening? Yeah. I think is important in enabling you to do a forecast, because a forecast shouldn't be done in your office. It should be done with a lot of information. Information from the field, right? Right. Yeah, and I've one thing that I've found a very helpful kind of trend that's come up recently is communicating risks early. Hey, I see this out 4 or 5 months from now. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it might happen, and if it happens, that's bad. Right. It's easier to focus on the risks than the opportunities. Yeah, and that is one thing I would say the upstream did quite well, is because we did have a lot of things that could go wrong. So if that ship sinks with that tower, the tower
Right.
on it or the structure on it, what are we going to do? That's a
Right.
major event. So there were a lot of what they used to call special cost and schedule allowance,
Mhm.
which was really a weighted risk, right?
Right.
So the chance of that happening is fairly small, but the
Yeah, but the
magnitude
impact
of it
is huge.
is big.
Right.
So we had, on my last big project, we had that, and we had to monitor that as part of the forecast to say, how much money are we keeping in of this? Well, that event passed, so we need to drop out that amount of money from
Right.
that. But another event has come in that we didn't anticipate, so here we're going to talk about it. And looking ahead and saying looking at the horizon and saying, what's out there?
Mhm.
What am I going to potentially find? And again, a lot of that has to do with your project management team and your project engineers and your project manager, and what are they seeing, and the procurement manager.
Right.
You know, what are you seeing on the horizon? That contractor is in financial problems. What are we going to do?
I've definitely heard
And
examples of owners having to basically carry the contractor's
Or go in
payroll.
or go in the night before it gets announced and pull everything from there. And I've heard that too.
Yeah, I believe that.
I've heard people, we have work in international, even a small project in a refinery these days may have
There's a lot of
purchased this
overseas
from
engineering.
overseas.
Right.
Engineering overseas, a lot of procurement
Yeah.
overseas. You're dealing with logistics of getting items into places that are challenging.
Well, and especially right now in October of 21 when supply chains are
Very challenging.
exactly.
Right, and making it difficult to get the schedule. You're also now in a world in this pandemic where we're not traveling over to see these things because
We
we
can't.
can't, right? So the travel has been very limited, which means that you're listening, Zooming, talking to them. You're looking at reports from the contractor or the fabricator, and maybe you can't see with your own eyes to verify.
Right.
So how do you actually get that information? Building that trust. One of my favorite ones was trust but verify. So how do I verify? Because I think you're a good person, but I don't know whether you're being sold a bill of goods.
Well, but if I don't know you,
and
if I don't know you, especially if you're on the other side of the world,
how am I gonna?
Exactly.
Right. And then you get into the cultures. How are different cultures? How do they handle things? Authority. How do they handle confrontation? Yeah. How do they? It's challenging to bring two cultural entities together that have a very, very different.
I've heard lots of interesting stories from Americans who have been in. The one I'm thinking of was in Mitsui in Japan, and he said he ended up working with them very well, but he had difficulty. He could tell that they had spotted a problem, but because of the cultural differences,
they're not going to share that.
Yeah, and he said he had to work very hard to get them comfortable raising issues to him.
Yeah. Yeah, it is very different. That we used to have that Globe Smart or whatever it was that did help some, but nothing like having the experience of dealing with different cultures to help you.
Well, and even within a culture, everybody's different, right?
Right.
You've kind of mentioned it with the introverted PM and the extroverted project controls manager, and I don't know their nationalities, but people are different, and you have to feel out the relationship as you go, and that's another thing that I can teach you how to do the math to do a forecast. I can teach you how to use a piece of estimating software.
Right.
I can teach you some funny look tests relatively easily. But until you get out there and you step in it in front of a project manager, it's harder to learn those skills.
It is harder to learn them, and getting people to listen to you, getting people to do what you suggest. It doesn't really do you any good to do a forecast that says, "Hey, we're going to have a problem." If the project manager says, "Well, I'm not going to tell anybody that. We're going to bury that for now." And yet, that was one of the great things about the way we did work, because we had people outside of the project team. We could go in and say, "Wait a minute.
Yeah.
What? That's not. You can't do that. That's not cool." And we got the support to show that.
Yeah.
But if you have a very top down, this is the way it is, and I'm reporting to them, and you're doing my ranking and rating. It's quite hard to have that independent forecast.
It is.
And to have it be believed. And as you know, people
especially
don't
if things are going off the rails.
Yeah, and people don't want to tell their bosses, we've got a problem. Though I can, give me time to fix it. Well, okay, there's a little bit of, I have to give you a little time to fix it, but at the same time, bad news doesn't really keep well.
Well,
and better to have somebody to come in and say, how can we help you with this?
Well, and that to me is the value of, call it a forecast funnel, call it a risk register, whichever you want to call it.
To say, here's the forecast as we see it now, but these risks are on the horizon, and if any of these come true, this is where we're looking. Yeah, we used to do the funnel charts to help explain the things. Even in estimating, when you do reviews, having people be able to look at an estimate, which might be hundreds of lines or hundreds of pages or whatever. Right. However, depending on how you do it.
Sure.
How do you direct the conversation to be, you really need to focus on these 10 things because this is where all the money is.
Right.
How do I get that conversation to happen? And not just focus on, well, that widget is, you don't have the right number for that. Okay, this is really not helpful. Same thing in the forecast. Where is most of the money coming? If you don't have a good idea on where costs are today, we talked about accruals, it's really hard to do a forecast because if I'm looking at the numbers coming in from the accounting software and they're saying I'm here, but in actuality there's 2 months of late bills that have never been entered.
Right.
I'm really over here. And now I'm forecasting that I only have, and it's like, well, these things aren't going to add up.
Right.
And at some point, that's going to be evident that you didn't count the number of people coming through the gate and do the math on how much they get an hour to how much money we're talking about.
Right.
And it can be very simple, like I just have to get a gate count every day. And I can do the gate count against what I see coming in and go, wow.
Yeah.
You don't want to ever do, your forecast based on what you've paid, because what's in the pipeline?
Yeah, a bunch of net 90 invoices that haven't been submitted yet. And...
Right. I had one where a project that a year had gone by. I thought I'd covered everything, and here came this bill for a drum that was a year late, and it's like I thought that had been paid.
Yeah.
But I hadn't quite gone through, and something else had come up, and it looked like, anyway, got caught out on that one. But you really have to have an attention to detail when you want to be in this role. You can't just do this slap and wish and a promise, and, this is just not going to be. It takes a lot of attention to detail. It's a lot of hard work.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you do have as many moving parts as you can have. If you've got a large project that has multiple vertical splits with a lot of T&M work for whatever legitimate reason, there's so many moving parts in it. And especially the smaller the team is, the harder it is to keep track.
Well, and
so you have to prioritize.
You know as well as I do that a lump sum job takes less people than a reimbursable job.
Right.
To do it right, because you're paying for everything, so you have
and you're
to verify.
shifting the risk to their side, to the contract side, not the owners.
Right. So you don't have to have quite as much to. If the productivity is bad on a reimbursable job, that's your issue.
Right.
So you need project engineers in the field to look at productivity.
Right.
If it's a lump sum, it's their issue, and in theory, you just need somebody to, check to see things are done and look at changes.
Right.
And that's where your focus is for project controls on the overall forecast. But if they're having the risk, you're not necessarily having to deal with what's my productivity forecast look like.
To a point, but I've definitely heard of projects where, from a cost perspective, they were just fine because most of their work was done lump sum and the T&M stuff was done early, and that part did okay. But there was a lot of pressure on the schedule.
Right.
So,
and that's where it becomes
exactly.
If the contractor decides, in order to minimize my losses, I'm going to stretch things out instead of pay overtime because I can't afford it.
Right.
Then you have reached a point where that becomes a big issue. We did have a lump sum contractor where we did keep track of their productivity, and we were able to show them, you guys are losing money.
Yeah.
And they were not very happy with us.
Sure.
It was like, well, okay, but and they're like, well, it's not your that's our business, and it's like, okay, but if it becomes a schedule issue, then it becomes our issue.
Right.
And they were sort of surprised that how project controls could actually help them do their jobs.
Yeah.
A lot of people discount it. And I think that's a short-sighted approach.
I think so too.
And I think it means that you end up being lulled into a false sense of security. And then the number of projects that went up in the last 10% were much higher.
Yeah.
Well, to be fair, they were probably having problems at 40%.
Yeah,
and
but they hadn't
60%,
identified
but
them.
nobody had talked about it. And
Right.
then all of a sudden we come in with these kinds of
Yeah, a
things.
guy that I work, some of those issues at 40%, even if you see them, you get an overly optimistic project manager, and that's the project manager's
Well,
job.
that is their job to
Right.
look at that and say, well, I can bring this back in, but if they don't have the information, they can't.
And a plan and a recommendation.
It's very hard for them to make changes. It's a freight train. It's moving forward. You
Yeah.
can't really do a whole lot to move it if you don't have the information.
Right.
You can do a lot more the earlier you can identify issues.
Yeah, all the way back to even scope planning and constructability. I've heard a story recently about a project was getting close to appropriation, and a new manager of development came in and looked at it and was like, we can't build this in this area with what we want to put in for a variety of constraints. And yeah, if you don't know that until you're halfway through the project, you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, you really are. I mean, there can be an optimistic estimate, and when somebody looks at it with an experienced eye, you can't do it for that.
Right.
And then, if you've done that before funding, that's a big plus, because then you
Right.
haven't spent the money to do it. And sometimes maybe a project needs to be killed,
Right.
and that's okay too.
Yeah, and I also I don't always think it's a bad thing because an estimate and a budget, ideally, yes, they're the same number, but they're not always the same number, right?
No, not always.
If a manager wants to challenge a project and say, I know your estimate is this, I'll give you 90%. And
Yeah.
and then it also gives you a bit of an out when you say, look, this was our estimate. You gave us a target. Here's what we did to try and match it. We didn't get there.
Right. That's a challenging one, because while
is.
I think that good in some ways to try and motivate people,
Yeah.
I know for me, if it becomes unachievable, I have a hard time getting really behind
Oh,
it.
there's definite downsides to it too. I completely agree with you on that.
I think you have to have a realistic target.
Yeah.
And you have to continue to strive towards that target. And if you get people who look at it and go,
There's no way.
there's no way.
Right.
I'm just going to try and minimize my losses rather than you. So you've got competing priorities, right?
Well,
My
you
priorities
always
are
have
this.
that.
You always do. But if they're this disconnected, then you end up with a real problem going forward. And so
especially if you have an unforgiving manager who doesn't want to hear why you didn't meet the stretch goal that he gave you.
Yeah.
He or she gave you.
Yeah, that's right. And I really think too that there's an awful lot to be said for the project team dynamics and making sure that people are aligned, have the same mindset, same goal, are functioning and pulling together as a team. And I don't think we do enough of that to make that happen.
Yeah.
I also get very upset when I see the project controls team being looked on as clerical rather than engineering.
Right.
To be fair, some contractors do view it as more clerical. It's
There's
just
certainly a
numbers
clerical
game.
aspect to it.
But I think if we hire engineers to do this, then we expect them to do more than just clerical.
I agree.
And I think that's the advantage. That's the competitive edge that we have.
Yeah.
Is that we have a team of people that really uses engineering thought processes to get to the forecast.
Right.
And to get to the schedule and to pull together as part of the team.
Yeah. I know. I mean, I don't have the personality to enjoy being a project manager, but I learned so much from that experience to help me be better at both estimating and controls.
I think at the end of the day, if they'd said to me, Maggie, you're 38 years with the company, we need you to go be a project manager, I could probably have done it because I've spent so much time around it.
Right.
But I didn't really want to be that person.
Right. Same for me.
I kind of liked the role of being the trusted advisor, second in command kind of role where I got to, I got to delve into the details and give you the information that you needed to do your job properly.
Right.
That was what I liked about the job.
Yeah.
Also, it didn't hurt that I wasn't called at 2 a.m. when a safety incident happened. That was the part I just didn't think I could deal with. I was married to a safety guy. I didn't need that. Yeah, we didn't need two of us doing that.
Understandable.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, it was. I'm thinking back to the one of the last teams I was on at Exxon. There was a lot of trust. There was a lot of very healthy debate.
And
they certainly didn't.
Great.
Absolutely.
I love it.
Oh,
I would not like it if they just took what I said.
Yeah, and there were certainly some. They definitely. I could tell that they trusted me, but they didn't take my word just because I said it. And part of it, like I mentioned earlier, is because they're in different meetings. They hear things differently. We're all privy to different information just because of our job.
That's right. I had one job where the project manager was a very nice guy, but not very effective. And he would wring his hands if things didn't go well, and it was like, okay. So I ended up, he never wanted to hear anything about the forecast. Never reviewed the forecast. Instead, I had the executive come into my office, and we wrangled through it every month.
Wow.
Because his name was on this project, and he wasn't going to let it happen. And he could see this was a skill that my PM didn't have.
Well, depending on the PM, I would ideally like them to be somewhat involved in the cost, but I fully recognize that there's a lot more on their plate, and they certainly don't have the time to dig into very much, if any, detail.
Well, and that's why they need somebody who they can trust to be that advisor that says, "Hey, this is where you're going," or "By the way, this is on the horizon."
Yeah.
You guys have, and you have to be conversant with the contract and understand what's in and what's out of the contract. You need to read the contract. A lot of people, that would be one of the things I first would say, and they're like, "Well, I don't need to read it." And I'm like, "No,
you at least need to read the principal document.
You need to know the principal document and all the exhibits.
Yeah.
And so you need to know what you've agreed and what has been, I mean, we had stupid things like we all assumed that an insulation contract included insulating the line and the valves. And the valves were not included.
Oh, geez.
And they came in with this change order, and I'm like, that's just stupid. They don't even look at this.
Yeah.
And I had to go back and read and I realized what they had done was they had say, we'll pay you for the straight line insulation, and you'll come back and give us a price for the. Oh. And we thought we had a price for the whole thing.
Yeah.
We didn't know that this was a piecemeal thing, and it was like, holy cow, this is. But whoever wrote that didn't have a concept about, I mean, you've given me 60% of the cost of this, and I'm evaluating it against 100% of the scope.
Right.
Not knowing that was, and so there's another one where you have to really understand what is it that you have agreed to.
Yeah.
But being conversant with that, it means you have to be on top of things, but you have to kind of have a finger in all of the pies. You need to talk to the procurement people. You need to talk to the admins. Sometimes you get information from them. The
if you happen upon the right fieldcraft guy who happened to notice something, that may or may not be a big deal.
It could be. And going with I often went with the safety guys, or I would go with the project. I didn't want to go with the project manager because people would tell them things different. But with the project engineer, I might get a different.
I remember I was talking with, he was a PMD, so a development guy, and I was asking him if he wanted me to copy him on the emails to the contractor on some relatively clerical thing. He said, no, because if I get involved, whether I want to or not, I bring a sledgehammer.
Yeah, well, it's a fair statement.
Yeah. We
did have a lot of sledgehammers in our company.
Well, and this guy wasn't that type of personality. He just recognized that due to his position and the authority that came with it, he recognized that it became more heavy-handed than he wanted it to, whether he wanted it to or not.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and that's a fair comment.
Yeah.
You do need to understand that. It was an interesting thing. I think that I remember one of my project managers I was an advisor, and then I got a $500 million project, and then I was an advisor again.
Okay.
And one of my project managers who I had dealt with on both sides of that big project, he goes, "You're a much better you're a much better advisor now that you've got this experience under your belt." And it's like, yeah, I get that.
Sure.
And that was a lot of the reason that I went through estimating and then got onto the project. It was very lovely to estimate a project and then be the controls manager on it, because
It's so much easier because you know where everything is.
I know where everything is, and also there's nobody to blame.
Right.
I put this together.
Right.
I'm responsible. I am part of the team. But that was a great way to do it. And when we were in I can't think of the right word, not at the home office level, but out in the refineries, doing projects in the refineries. I often structured it that way, where my estimators would go onto the project team so that they would have that experience. And I had a whole lot less of, well, you didn't put enough money in the estimate. It's like, no.
You did.
We're going to have this.
Right.
Also, if you know you're going to have to live with it, then that same project manager I talked to, he used to pad his estimates, so trying to get money back out during the estimate review phase.
Yeah.
You know, it was the games that he would play. Like, wait, you're not going to put that many cranes on Baytown Avenue. There's no way.
Right.
No way they're going to close that for you. No way.
Right.
So don't even tell me you need those, because they're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So knowing a little bit
And it's
about
hard to maintain that neutrality between, because there's always that tension between the business doesn't want to spend as much on a project and the PM wants to make sure they can bring it in.
And the PM is going to want a project, if he can get it, a project that he can easily come in under.
Right.
It really looks good. But then the gatekeepers would be looking at it and going, well, this guy's coming in at 75%. I've left money on the table.
Right.
You need to be in there as the advisor, making sure that that estimate is really not overly. It's like, okay, so I had the gatekeeper on board.
Yeah.
They were very much wanted my opinion. If I said it was okay, then they were they were okay with it. But that was the part of the process of going through the estimates to make sure that it was an unbiased estimate.
Right.
And starting with an unbiased estimate is a good place to start for controls.
Oh yeah.
I don't really know how I would do a project where there wasn't a good estimate. It's pretty hard to almost develop the estimate after you've gotten the money, but you have to have something that says, what am I going to spend this on?
Right.
And 6 line items, X number of tons times $2,500 a ton is not a great estimate. So how do I get a little bit more depth in there? Sometimes you get the contractor's estimate, but you're foolish if you think that is the final number.
Well, and even if you have enough working relationship with that contractor to know that they're not trying to screw you, ideally you ask, and this doesn't always happen, I want you to do assume no rain, assume no delays.
Yeah.
I want a lean estimate.
Right. And
I am happy to grant you changes when it rains and when we're late on our side of it.
Right.
But it's hard for both sides of that to get that kind of estimate.
Yeah. And we haven't talked about changes. So changes are also a very, very big piece of project controls. Vetting them to make sure they're valid changes, understanding as I said, like the change order on valve insulation. One of those that irritated me. But understanding what they're talking about and making sure they're timely.
Yeah.
My first project, I got snookered by a fellow we called the Silver Fox, because he came in, they underbid the job, we kind of knew it. It was a bunch under the test estimate we had. Yeah. And he came in and every note we had a stack of change orders, like really no joke, within the first month.
Jeez.
A stack like this. But they all said cost and schedule impact to follow. So our project engineer just said, okay, I'm waiting.
Yeah.
Well, waiting implied acceptance.
Right.
Because we didn't refute the change.
Right.
We were waiting to get all the information to refute it, but that would imply in a court of law that we accepted it.
Right.
So, being on top of changes, even if it's a paper issue. Right. Nope, we're not going to give you a change for that. That's in your contract.
And certainly not all of those changes would be bad.
No, some of them were spurious, and we ended up going to court. And
oh, really?
Yeah. The value of the contract was X. They claimed 2X.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, and we settled for about 1.6 6,
Mm.
which was way above what we had planned.
Yeah.
But you know, we had a team of, I think the oldest person on the project was in his 30s,
Oh, wow.
and with a team of right out of school 25-year-olds, and we didn't have any experience, and the
Right.
contractor put in experienced people.
Yeah.
It was a classic, you know, experience. It was a, you have to have a mix of experience. You have to have somebody mentoring you to say, hey, here's what you need to look out for.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, it's a recipe for disaster. I mean,
Yeah.
an example was, we got all of the procurement dates from a contractor, and we wrote those dates into the contract for construction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, no
Schedule reserve or
contingency,
anything,
no
right?
schedule reserve, no thought that any of them would be late.
Right.
And of course, more than a few were
Sure.
late. And they said, we had all these people here ready to go.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know, again, experience would have told us that you don't ever do that.
Right.
And so a lot of my job was to relay these kinds of things. It makes it sound like, okay, I'm giving you all the old war stories, and you know, you gotta listen to all these old war stories. But the truth was, if you don't have any experience and
You don't
nobody's
know
there
what
to
you
teach
don't
you,
know, right?
how are you ever going to learn?
Mhm.
And I don't want you to make these mistakes again. No, you won't make these, you'll make different ones. But at least if you've heard it, you might have
You'll at least think about
a little less chance that you'll.
Yeah.
So a good bit of my job was teaching, because I
Mhm.
felt mentorship was trying to make sure that I, you know, didn't put people in a position of having a very expensive first project that was a disaster.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, the most expensive training ground ever.
Yeah. And it's hard to know coming back to changes. Certainly there's going to be some change. Rarely do you have the time to wait around for a complete enough package, whether that be to an engineering contractor or a field contractor. So it's hard to know the balance of talking to a contractor saying, hey, we know this isn't in, right as a change later. You've got to have a lot of trust in your contractor and the contract staff when you end up having to do stuff like that.
Yeah, and you know, some of these changes aren't necessarily their fault.
Oh, sure.
You know, so we were breaking ground for pumps that we had gotten approval, went through all of the stuff, had the owner's rep in there, and made approved the best owner's rep in the cat plant. This was the key. They had a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
We go to break ground, and they come out and go, you can't do that. That's where we put our turnaround crane. You can't put this pump here. We're like, we're ready. We're cutting ground, cutting the concrete.
Oh.
And it turned out you have to have the right people involved.
Right.
And we had the owner's rep, but the owner's rep didn't get the turnaround people to review the plot plan.
Right.
And, you know, here we were, done all the engineering, done all the procurement, all the pipe that says it's going to go to here.
Man,
Now we got to move these pumps, so
Yeah.
we need longer pipe runs. We have now to do foundations that we have to drill, you know. I mean, it was just, and it was like, okay, if we'd known this 8 months ago, we would have designed it over here. We wouldn't have designed it where you put your crane. Obviously,
Right.
that's not going to be, you know, that's a non-starter. But getting the right people in the reviews, and a lot of it, I don't have time. It's like, nope, you better make time, because this is important.
Well, and even some of those that you see early, some of the knock-on effects. There was a project that I was involved with that it had optimistic things factored into some of they knew about the design changes, they identified the design changes, but some of the other ancillaries like bulks around the pieces of equipment, they made optimistic assumptions of, we can re-wheel this, we can put a new impeller in this pump. Well, when the feed contractor looked at it, you couldn't.
No.
Well, we can put this pump right back there, it'll work. Well, when you put stress on the pipe that's been there for 50 years,
it's not going to work.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that was one of
and none of those individual things were big cuts, but the project ended up doubling between checkpoint and gate.
Yeah, and better to have it double then than after.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But you know, the getting the knock-on effects in is very important, because you just don't realize what that can do to the projects. Not just, and it's also not. It depends on when you do it, right?
Well, and there's a
do
balance
this in
there
the
too.
Turnaround, okay. Well, cha-ching, cha-ching. I'm going to do this offshore. Well, cha-ching, 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 because that's very expensive.
And it's hard to
So-
find the balance of, I know the pump won't fit there, but I don't think it'll be halfway across the plant, right? So, because sometimes you see that too.
Yeah, that's true. Or
Less often, I would say.
right. The ones that used to scare me is we've got this new drum we want to put into an existing structure. Ugh. Ugh.
Yeah.
Already feeling the cringe coming on that one, and then it's like
Seen
okay,
that done
but it's-
successfully, but I'm sure that's the
Yeah.
exception.
But it's kind of bigger than the opening, and it's got to go under this pipeways. So we have to dig out, so that well, nobody thought about I have to dig the road out to get this thing under.
Right.
And then how do I get it? Actually, how do I? It's easy to put it in a structure when you're building the structure up around it. How do I shoehorn it in? So looking at those kinds of things, you're like, wow, this has to be thought through in the estimate phase pretty thoroughly. But if it's one of those things that comes up as a change,
Yeah.
and now I got to really think through those knock-on effects and how am I actually physically going to do this?
But if you do think about it, I've heard successful stories about we designed this tower because we had this turning radius at this pipe rack, and it couldn't go over the tangent. The diameter couldn't be bigger.
This because
Exactly.
I'm turning right.
And it's got to fit under that little pipe rack right over there.
Well, we had one where the contractor wanted to do modularization because this is going to save us money, and it's like, yeah, but we're putting this in an existing refinery.
Right.
All right. So have you checked the
Can you get the
window?
module in? Right.
Can you get the and it turned out they can't for that size opening, they couldn't effectively put enough labor into the modules. You'd have to break them up into so many pieces.
Right.
Now you're adding steel around each one. That's added a lot to it.
Yeah.
Modules are great for a grassroots site. Modules inside an existing refinery need a lot of thought.
Oh yeah.
And the very first thing you should do is, what's my envelope?
That's why most of the modules I've seen and most of my experience has been in revamp are not very big skid,
They're
relatively
almost
small skids.
Yeah, and they can be very effective.
Absolutely.
But they're, you're balancing the cost of extra materials with labor being done in a shop environment versus in the field.
Right, and there's even a balance on grassroots stuff. I was talking with somebody who did a study on that, and I don't remember the outcome off the top of my head, but I certainly remember that there's a break-even point where,
Yeah.
and some of that's
Sometimes
dependent on
it's-
your site and how big a ship you can get into your port and whether you can get the crawlers underneath the modules and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. But I was very disappointed that nobody on the contractor side had asked the very obvious question about how big a module can we put in there.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. And we'd done module studies for a while, and it's like,
Just constructability in general.
yes, constructability,
Oh crap, we have a
operability.
power line right next to this big long pipe run. Can we actually put a crane here or not?
Yeah, exactly. Or I've got to have a crane that I need to be able to lay down in a hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have those kind of things happen quite frequently. So where have I got a 600-foot place I can lay down the boom?
Yeah.
Or sometimes it takes months to build these things.
Mm-hmm.
How am I going to? How do I clear the area so that they can build this? Because I can't have people walking under it when they're building this.
Right.
There's a lot of things that go into it, but that was why I really very strongly, back to the boots on the ground comment, is I can't go into a project and tell you how they're doing as an advisor unless we walk the field.
Right.
I'm not going to be able to tell you anything, and I walk the field all over the place. Singapore,
Mm-hmm.
Antwerp, Baton Rouge, Baytown, Beaumont, all of the refineries that we had been to. If you wanted a project in there, I needed to see where you were doing. In fact,
Yeah.
if you didn't have a site walk when you were doing the estimate, that was a flag number one.
Absolutely.
You had to be out there to look at it. And even some of the stuff in the estimate, you'd be like, the designer goes, well, it's going to go here. And you're like, I don't think
How are you going to put that in
I
there?
don't think you can do that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. So you then have conversations with the project manager. How are we going to physically do this?
Mm-hmm.
So lots of very interesting things. One other thing I'll say that I thought about on the way up here, I think one of my biggest successes was that I always treated the company's money as my own.
Mm-hmm.
So if I would feel that I wasn't going to spend money like on an expense account and buy a bunch of stuff.
Right.
I bought a bottle of wine and dinner with a group of people. That's great. but I wasn't the kind of going to go out and say, an expense report, I'm going to do all of this.
Yeah.
And therefore, I felt the same way about the company's money. If I felt it was a fair change and you gave me a change order that was a reasonable amount, and I tested it and vetted it a bunch of different ways, fine. Didn't have a problem with it.
Right.
But if I looked at it and said, you're trying to shiest me, I'm very unhappy with that, and I would go back to you and we would have a very different conversation.
Yeah.
So I think, if I wouldn't have paid for it myself, I know we're talking millions and tens of millions
Right.
and hundreds of millions of dollars. But I mean, at the end of the day, I felt like that was one of the assets that I had, is I would look at it and go, well, wait a minute, is this reasonable? Is it accurate? Is it fair? If I didn't feel like those things were being met, I didn't have any compunction in going back to them and saying, yeah, come on.
Yeah.
Yeah, come on, you guys, you're not going to do this. Even today when we're doing stuff, my husband and I, and we're like, a contractor will give a friend of ours a bid, and we're like, well, wait a minute, if we do the math, that's so much, let's just say it's 50-50 material labor. Well, how much? That means this number of people. That seems like a lot.
Yeah.
And you just end up using the math that you learned. Like, yeah, that seems like a lot. If I'm not going to pay a welder,
and even
I'm going to pay you. Well, come on.
Even the schedule side, it's like, well, you have this many hours, and you're going to tell me you're going to this soon? You can't throw that many people at it. My kitchen's not that big.
No, that's right. How am I going to physically? You think that number, that's 40 people. How am I going to fit in there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what are we going to do? We don't have that much space.
Right.
The density issues, but it's the kinds of things that you look at and you go, okay, I need to run it out in my head and say, is this reasonable? Does this make sense? And I think the common sense approach to that helped a lot with change orders.
Yeah. Assuming you have enough experience to have that common sense.
Yeah. Well, how do you get that experience into people?
Right. That's where the mentorship comes in.
The mentorship is very important, and that was what I don't know if you remember, but I would go visit a large project, and then I would come visit the local project office.
Right.
And part of my process on that was that this community of cost engineers, some are located at the refineries and some were located in the home office. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't just mentoring the people who are on large projects, because my view was you might be pulled up to a large project, and I needed to make sure you had those skills.
Right.
And also letting you see in the smaller project world what's out there.
Right.
It's not just I'm going to work on these projects for the rest of my career. Some people really loved being in a refinery and didn't want to move locations. Great, I have no problem with it.
Right.
But you should have the same, opportunity to mentorship in your field as the people who are out on the large projects.
Right. I mean, even if you don't want to move, that doesn't mean that a big project won't come to your site.
Well, that's what happened with mine. Is I was 25 years in Baytown, and then we had a big project come, and I told everybody I'm going to be the project controls manager. And they never asked me. They just assumed I was. It was because I told literally everybody. So I never got I'm not even sure there was an announcement. It was just I saw my name on the org chart, and I'm like, well, I guess I got the job.
That's awesome.
Sometimes be careful what you wish for. You know, they're not always easy.
Right.
But it was it is an opportunity that would not have come to me, because I had small children, didn't want to move.
Right.
But they had a big project that came to the place I was, and I got put on it.
Yeah.
And then that springboarded me into an assignment overseas and a mentorship in being in the global world.
Right.
So my first 25 years, I had 9 years in upstream, 25 years in a refinery.
Okay.
And then the rest of my career was in the global world.
Okay.
But regardless, mentorship was mentorship.
Yeah.
If you are working on a $4 million project, I can teach you skills that help you run that project.
Yeah.
That are equally applicable to a $400 million project.
And one
you
thing
just have more people, and you have, you might have to step up a little bit and not sweat some of the details.
Right.
But again, attention to detail is one of those things that you needed to have.
Especially on a small project where things move so quick, and if you blink and miss an issue, your project is in trouble.
Yeah, exactly.
And you get to see so many more projects, which means you get to see so many more issues. Whether they're resolved or not is a different question, but you at least get to see more stuff.
You do. Yeah, you have a very broad range of experience and I kind of feel like that's a great way to start.
I think so.
I don't think you should start on the large projects for the reason I talked about. Why
Yeah.
are you going to put a 25-year-old on a project that's $700 million? You're
Right.
stupid. This is just this is just cha-ching. You're going to spend a lot more money.
Right.
If you put that 25-year-old on a small projects world, either as a project engineer or in small project controls, their opportunities to make a large cost and schedule mistake are less. So the risk is less, but then you also give them an opportunity to get this broad experience that they can then take to the next larger job.
And because of the size of the budget, I'm struggling I don't want to say the mistakes are amplified, because kind of they are and kind of they're not, right?
Well,
a small mistake on a multi-billion-dollar venture, probably not that big a deal. A small mistake on a $2 million project is a big deal for that $2 million project.
My first estimate moving from, I had a Baton Rouge project, moving from out of upstream to work on a project to do an estimate. And the estimate was about $2.5 million. This was ages ago, early 90s.
Yeah.
Loading arm project in Baton Rouge.
Okay.
My project before that, $2 million was the third significant digit in my cost.
Right.
So everything after that, was insignificant.
Rounded. Right.
Right. And even 2.5, I thought I had the project manager down to the penny talking about it, because for $2 million he couldn't afford to not have an idea of what everything was. It was a much smaller. It was a good experience, because I was like, who cares? This is just round off where I come from. You know? I mean, this is nuts.
It's hard to make that shift back in both directions.
It did take a while to get to that point, and then recognize that person had to answer to their bosses, and refining margins were much different than where I had come from.
Right.
That you have to understand the business you're operating in, and to do a good job for your project manager, you need to understand what their constraints are in that world they're operating in.
Yeah.
Where are the pinch points that somebody's gonna have a problem?
Right.
I'm gonna go so long on the project that I put you in a position where you're now having either a regulatory compliance date you missed, or you're having to go purchase crude or product because we couldn't deliver it.
Right.
What is the impact? It's not just I'm late and it's going to cost a little bit more money. Sometimes I've got a huge.
We missed a commercial window.
Yeah. So what is that? What are we going to do to try and meet that? Because that, if you're just looking at here's my money, but you don't understand the impact of that on the larger, I'm doing this work for this refinery, this chem plant, or this upstream entity.
Well,
what is that? Schedule in the upstream was king, because I need to be on stream. And every day you're late, I don't care if it costs me tens of millions of dollars, because every day is money lost.
Right.
So schedule was very much more important in the early projects that I had, and cost was almost like an afterthought.
Right. You
get to the refinery where we're operating on a 3% margin. Every penny is important.
Right.
If it costs a lot of money, and even though you got capital dollars to deal with, sometimes the expense dollars that went with it were the things that were the most important. Right. Because those were the ones that they had to pay for.
Well, and I was talking to somebody today, it's something in the agricultural industry. Harvest is in September. If we can bring the start date into September, great. If we can't, there's no reason to spend the extra money.
No, that's right. And we'll have to wait till after it anyway.
Right. So we might as well take our time, and because it's still a viable project. We just missed one harvest.
Yeah, that's right. So understanding the business drivers behind the project was one of those things that took me from being just the cost engineering flunky doing all of this stuff to the next level where I'm now a valued member of the team, because I understand what motivates you. Right. And I'm keeping an eye out for that over here on the side maybe, but understanding that if I'm doing this and it causes you to have to do something else, that might make a different decision than if I'm just cost and schedule on my own project.
Right.
So that was an interesting thing. So let's take a minute and say, is this what you're looking for?
Yeah.
Is this okay?
No, this is good conversation.
Okay. Because I haven't talked about this in a while, but I used to find the mentorship was the part that I really enjoyed the most.
Yeah.
And spending time with people and helping them to understand it and to find the passion that I found for it.
Yeah.
It was a great job. It was like, they pay me to do this? This is amazing.
Yeah.
I've always had that.
Now that I'm in my mid-career and I'm a bit on both sides of it,
Right.
I find it interesting as well.
Yeah. But
It was really rewarding when I was an anchor. One year we hired 3 new people, and I would set aside an hour a week. This is your hour.
Yeah, we're going to.
If we don't need it, that's fine. I don't have an agenda. What issues are you running into?
Right. Tell me how I can help you do your job better.
Exactly.
I found that late in my career. I became a supervisor at 55, which is quite late to be a supervisor. But it was not hard to make the transition because a lot of the mentoring that I did of people, now I'm paid to do this. Okay,
Yeah.
Great. No problem.
Yeah.
But it was very interesting to be on that side of it and then go back into a technical role after that, because then it was like, okay, now I get why you're talking about this. And, I used to have I'd go to projects and it would be a little test. Not really. I'd talk about, okay, here's what you're doing now. Here's what you need to do to really elevate your piece of this into the greater picture. Small things sometimes, nothing that took a lot of, but it required discretionary effort.
Right.
I could tell right away, based on the response I got to, I want you to do something more than you're doing, where they ended up in the rank group. Right? So the people who were like, yeah, that sounds great, you're going to help me do my job, always in the top half. Good attitude, yeah, I may need some more help getting over that, but I don't understand what you're talking about, but I'm willing. The ones who were like, no, I have this much to do, or here are all the reasons I can't do what you're looking for.
Yeah.
I knew those people were automatically in the bottom half.
Yeah.
And, that required then a different level of support for me, because now I've got to overcome their natural reluctance to do something for me to get them to do something.
Yeah.
And that then made my job a lot harder. But it was the little tests like that helped me to
know where you stood.
To know where I stand.
Yeah.
It was also things like when I first became an advisor at the U.S. level, right? So I'm going to all of the U.S. refineries, dealing with projects, say, from 20 million and below, 2 to 20 million.
Right.
You go from working on one project to working remotely through people on a bunch. And it's like playing baseball on one field and then going to a multiplex and watching all of the games at the same time.
Yeah.
And having to then say, okay, now I need different skills than I had before. And how do I then raise up to do that? And how do I learn to work through people when it would be so much easier if I just did it myself? So those skills, as you said, were mid-career for me in my 30s and early 40s. That was the time frame that I was having to learn those skills.
Right.
And, that's hard to do. And some people never make that transition. Some people are like, they're good workers, they're good soldiers.
And some people are very happy with that.
You need soldiers.
Absolutely.
You need people who are willing to do that work, but it's, trying to mentor them. I found that there were people who I thought had the ability to do more than they themselves thought.
Yeah.
And they often were either reluctant, that would require them to go out of their comfort zone. And, those were the ones that were a little more challenging to mentor. And then I had to really pull back and say, okay, how do we align what you want with what I want? And maybe it's small steps instead of bigger steps.
And that's a hard conversation to
okay.
have from the mentee side of, I know what you want for me. I don't want that. Right.
And that was a real hard thing for me coming as an American to being in England. And the English people, I had one gal, she ended up quitting because she said, this isn't what I want. And we were like, we're going to send you overseas. We've got plans for you. You're very good. We love it. And she's like, I don't want this.
Right.
This isn't what I signed up for.
Yeah.
And, that was a brash American coming in and learning not everybody has the same goals and mindset.
Right.
And even though we work for an international company, some people are locally based and like that, and we have jobs for them too.
Yeah.
So, the mistakes that you make along the way help you learn
Yep.
to do better as you go. But I think it's, the getting into the advisor role gave me the opportunity to sort of see a much broader view of things, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, instead of being down at the porthole level, I'm up at the helm, and I'm helping drive the ship and going which way we're going to go. How are we going to go forward with all of these projects together? So I think that was a very helpful thing. But everybody has to go through that progression in their career to find where it is they want to be.
Right.
And, maybe that requires things that they don't particularly want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And working for a global company, sometimes that requires a move, and not everybody's wanting to do that.
Right.
Right. So we moved our kids in high school, and that was tough.
I bet.
It was really hard. But we had a great time, and the kids really enjoyed it after we got through the first few phases.
Yeah.
First few months were tough. But that allowed me to see a different region and to say, okay, well, what have I learned over here? Does that apply? Some did, some didn't.
Right.
Teaching a class turned out you can't use humor in a class where most people are English as a second language because they don't get it. It doesn't translate.
Right.
And they're busy trying to figure out what you're saying, and then you're using these idioms and conversation, and it's like, I need you to speak plain English.
Right.
So I very quickly had to adapt my teaching style in a foreign country to be able to effectively teach people, and it was like, wow, that's not what I expected. That was hard. Yeah, it was kind of hard.
I bet.
But I ended up learning to say good morning in a bunch of different languages so that I would greet them in the morning with their own language. And we developed a camaraderie that was different than, than the way I would have taught the class in the U.S.
Right.
But anyway, worked out well.
Well, I do appreciate you coming. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you. I appreciate being involved. I'm glad to be a part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.